Frank Dalton sat at his kitchen table staring at the stack of bills that seemed taller each month, the pale yellow light of the overhead lamp flickering with the same tired rhythm he felt in his bones, and for a moment he wondered if the world had quietly decided to keep moving without him. 67 years old, a retired auto mechanic who once could rebuild an engine blindfolded, now left with shaky hands that trembled slightly when he tried to balance his checkbook, Frank let out a sigh that carried the weight of decades. Outside, the early spring morning was gray and restless, wind rattling the windows of his small-town Ohio home, but inside the silence pressed harder than the weather. He picked up the electric bill again, squinting at the numbers, muttering, "Guess I'll just keep sitting in the dark," and for the first time it didn't sound like a joke but like a resignation. The television murmured in the background, half on out of habit, a parade of news stories he never fully watched anymore. He was about to reach for the remote when a voice cut through the static, confident, fast, carrying that mix of daring and certainty that felt so foreign in Frank's quiet house. It was Elon Musk, speaking at some event, his hands moving as if he could pull the future down from the air itself. "We are building a future where clean energy isn't a luxury," Elon said, his voice steady, "it's a necessity, and it will be affordable for everyone. SolarCity is about giving power back to people, literally." Frank paused with the remote in his hand. Something about those words caught him, not the corporate pitch but the conviction underneath it, like the man actually believed every syllable. Frank leaned forward, elbows on the table, his eyes narrowing as though trying to catch some hidden spark between the pixels of the screen. Elon continued, talking about how ordinary families could cut their bills, how rooftops could power neighborhoods, how the old way of thinking, fossil fuels, waste, dependence, wasn't the only way forward. Frank thought about his own roof, shingles curling with age, and for a moment he saw sunlight bouncing off panels that weren't there. He scoffed and shook his head, muttering, "That's for the young folks, not for an old man like me," but the thought refused to vanish. It clung to him, stubborn, the way grease used to cling under his nails after a long day at the shop. He remembered the years he spent in that garage, fixing cars, giving people a second chance on wheels they thought were done for. He'd always believed machines could be pushed a little further, that with enough patience and skill you could make something run again even if everyone else had given up on it. Yet here he was, unable to imagine pushing himself forward. The contrast gnawed at him. The kettle whistled softly on the stove, though he'd forgotten he'd set it to boil, and as he poured the water into a chipped mug, his mind replayed Elon's words. Clean energy, affordable, power back to people. It sounded bigger than politics, bigger than age. It sounded like a challenge. Frank sat back down and stared at Mary's picture on the wall above the counter. She'd been gone 5 years, cancer taking her quickly after retirement, leaving him with an empty bed and the hum of appliances for company. She used to tell him he was a dreamer in disguise, a man who liked machines not just because they worked but because of what they represented, possibility. He whispered toward the picture, "You'd probably laugh at me, thinking about solar panels," and for a second he swore her smile in that photo seemed to warm. He took a sip of tea and turned back to the screen. The anchor was summarizing Musk's announcement, explaining how the initiative would expand across small towns, not just big cities. Frank rubbed his temple, thinking how unfair it was that excitement belonged to the young, that men like him were expected to fade quietly into fishing trips and card games while the future roared ahead without them. The thought made his chest ache, not in the way of clogged arteries but in the way of regret. He remembered being 17, building a makeshift windmill in shop class. The blades were cut from sheet metal, jagged and uneven, but he'd been proud of it, convinced he could generate power if only the wind cooperated. His classmates laughed, the teacher shook his head, and Frank had taken it apart before graduation. He never told Mary about it, never told anyone, but sometimes in the quiet of his garage he thought about what might have happened if he'd stuck with that dream. What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? Elon's voice seemed to echo that exact thought inside his head, though the man hadn't said it verbatim. Frank felt a strange current stir in his chest, as if the years hadn't fully closed the door. He set down the mug and leaned closer to the screen, his lips forming words without sound. What if it isn't too late? He knew his neighbors would roll their eyes. They already joked about how Frank Dalton kept talking to his wife's picture, how he sat alone at the diner reading newspapers like the world hadn't moved online. His son, David, busy with a tech job in California, barely returned his calls and always told him to take it easy, Dad. That phrase, it burned. Take it easy, like he was some fragile object. He didn't feel fragile, not in the way they imagined. He felt unused, like a tool left rusting in the shed. And suddenly, watching Elon Musk describe a solar-powered future, Frank realized he didn't want to be left in the shed. He turned down the volume and let the silence expand. His house groaned as the furnace kicked on, an old beast guzzling gas, and Frank frowned. The bill on the table mocked him, the numbers climbing higher than his fixed income could handle. But beneath the frustration, a thought shimmered, almost too bold to hold, maybe he could try. Not to change the world, not to compete with billionaires, but to prove to himself that he wasn't finished. He whispered, one step, and the sound of his own voice startled him. He hadn't spoken aloud to anyone in hours. He folded the bill and tucked it into a drawer, as if hiding the weight of his problems for just one night. He would sleep, maybe dream, but he knew when the sun rose, the idea would still be there, clinging like grease under his fingernails. For the first time in years, he wasn't dreading the morning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Dalton had never thought much about the word legacy until the silence of retirement wrapped around him like an oversized coat he couldn't shrug off, heavy and suffocating, reminding him every day that the rhythm of the world had moved on without asking for his permission. He used to wake up before dawn, slip into his coveralls, and drive the 10 minutes to Dalton's Auto, the little garage he had run for 35 years on the edge of town, a place where the smell of motor oil and burnt rubber seemed etched into the walls, where customers trusted him to bring their dead engines back to life. That garage had been his stage, his battlefield, his sanctuary, and when he locked its doors for the last time 2 years after Mary's passing, he swore he could hear the building sigh with him, like two old friends giving in to time together. Life after that was quiet, too quiet, filled with long mornings stretching into empty afternoons where the only sound was the ticking of the kitchen clock or the hum of an aging refrigerator. He tried filling the void with routine, coffee at sunrise, a slow walk to the mailbox, an occasional game of checkers with Earl, his neighbor across the street, but no matter how much he filled the hours, the truth was undeniable, he was living a half-life, moving through days like an extra in a play he once headlined. He thought often about Mary, her laughter like wind chimes, her gentle way of tugging him back to earth when his ideas floated too far into the clouds. They had met at a county fair, a mechanic and a schoolteacher, two different worlds colliding in the glow of Ferris wheel lights. She used to watch him work in the garage, leaning on the doorway with a smile that said she saw more in him than he dared to admit. "You're not just fixing cars, Frank," she'd say. "You're fixing hope. Don't you see that?" He never knew how to respond, but her words stuck. After she was gone, the silence of the house was more than silence, it was absence. He would reach for her in the night, only to touch the cold sheet beside him, and every morning he'd pass her photo in the hallway, whispering small updates like she was still listening. Their son, David, once the boy who rode his bike around the garage pretending to be Frank's apprentice, had grown into a man of circuits and screens. David had chosen technology over wrenches, a career in Silicon Valley where algorithms mattered more than carburetors. Frank had tried to be proud, and he was, but the distance stretched more than miles. Phone calls dwindled into quick check-ins, visits shrank to Christmas cards, and somewhere between Frank's pride and David's ambition, the bond thinned like an old belt ready to snap. Frank carried the weight of their estrangement heavily, though he rarely admitted it. He told himself it was natural, kids moving on, lives diverging, but late at night when the television glow painted his living room, he wondered if he had failed as a father, if he had been too consumed by grease and gears to notice the man his boy had become. Regrets collected like dust in corners he couldn't reach. He regretted never taking Mary on that trip to Yellowstone they'd always talked about, regretted snapping at David the day he announced he wanted to leave town, regretted not finishing the windmill he'd started as a teenager. That memory burned brighter than most, the image of his classmates laughing as the crooked blade spun awkwardly in the schoolyard. He dismantled it in shame, yet a part of him always wondered what might have happened if he had ignored their laughter and kept building. That thought haunted him in quiet moments, whispering that he had buried more than a project that day, he had buried a piece of himself. Retirement should have been restful, but instead it felt like exile, a punishment for outliving purpose. Doctors told him to slow down, neighbors told him to enjoy the quiet, but inside he felt restless, like a motor idling with no gear to catch. He noticed his hands, once steady enough to rebuild engines, now trembling slightly when holding a coffee cup. He noticed his knees ache on cold mornings. Every reminder of age felt like another vote against him, another tally mark in the column of irrelevance. Yet in the middle of these long gray days, he sometimes caught glimpses of the man he had been, the man who fixed things, the man Mary believed in, the man who once built a windmill and dared to believe it could work. Those glimpses flickered like faulty headlights, not enough to guide him forward, but enough to keep him from giving up completely. The town around him shifted too, faster than he liked. The diner installed touchscreen menus, kids zipped by on electric scooters, and the old hardware store where he used to buy screws and bolts closed, replaced by a boutique selling scented candles. Frank felt invisible in his own hometown, a relic standing in line behind people who barely looked up from their phones. Sometimes he wanted to grab them and shout, "I mattered once. I built things with these hands." But instead, he swallowed the words, carried his groceries home, and sat alone at his kitchen table. His neighbors were kind enough, offering waves or casual conversation about the weather, but he could tell they saw him as one of the retired old guard, harmless and fading. When the town hosted its annual festival last summer, nobody asked him to help fix the rides or tune the engines. They hired a company from the city, and Frank sat on a folding chair eating cotton candy, watching strangers tighten bolts on machines he could have repaired blindfolded. It stung, more than he admitted. What hurt most wasn't the exclusion, it was the realization that he had let himself become someone they didn't even think to ask. Legacy, he thought again, staring at Mary's photo one evening. What was his? A garage now rented to someone else, a son who barely called, a windmill that never spun. He clenched his fists, veins showing against wrinkled skin, and whispered, "Is this it?" He didn't know if he was asking Mary, God, or the walls. The only answer was the hum of the refrigerator. That night, he dreamed of being young again, standing in shop class, windmill blades spinning strong and steady, classmates watching not with laughter but awe. He woke with his heart pounding, sweat on his forehead, and the taste of possibility in his mouth. It faded with the sunrise, but something lingered, the memory of believing in himself, however briefly. He sat with that feeling over his morning coffee, staring at the horizon through his kitchen window. The sun rose stubborn and bright, spilling light across his roof, and Frank thought about how much energy it carried, how much waste it seemed to be to just let it fall without use. He shook his head, smiling at the foolishness of the thought, but deep inside he felt a small, stubborn flame, the kind that had once pushed him to take apart engines no one else dared to touch. He told himself it was just a memory, just nostalgia, but in truth, it was a call, a reminder of the life he once had before the shift, before the silence, before he started believing his best work was behind him. Frank Dalton woke before dawn, the kind of restless waking that wasn't caused by dreams but by the weight of thoughts that refused to let him sleep, and as he lay there staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily above his bed he felt a heaviness in his chest that wasn't illness but something harder to name, a question he couldn't silence. What was the point of all this now? He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the cold floor biting at his bare feet, and rubbed his knees until the stiffness subsided enough to stand. In the mirror by the dresser he caught his reflection, shoulders stooped, hair grayer than it had been even last year, eyes ringed with that dullness that came not from fatigue but from absence of purpose, and he muttered, "You look like a man already fading," before turning away. In the kitchen, the coffee machine burbled, filling the air with a smell that once comforted him but now felt like routine without reward. He sat at the table, steaming mug in hand, staring again at the electric bill he hadn't yet paid, the numbers glaring up like a reminder of limits. His stomach tightened with the thought of rationing heat, of keeping lights off longer, of becoming one of those stories on the news about seniors choosing between food and power. The humiliation of it pressed against him, and he whispered, "Is this really what it comes to?" The question felt heavier than the bill itself. Later that morning he walked to the hardware store, or rather the chain version that had replaced the old family-owned shop, and as he moved slowly through the aisles he noticed the way clerks barely glanced at him, their eyes sliding past as though old men belonged to the shelves rather than the customers. When he asked about solar panel kits, the young man with the badge that read, Kyle, chuckled lightly and said, "Those are kind of tricky, sir, not sure they'd be worth it for you," the emphasis on you slicing sharper than intended. Frank forced a smile, thanked him, but inside he burned with humiliation and anger. Was he really too old to even be considered capable of trying? On the walk home the cold air stung his face, and he found himself muttering, "I fixed engines bigger than your whole career, kid," though no one heard. That night he phoned David, partly out of habit, partly out of a stubborn need to hear his son's voice, but when David finally answered it was rushed, background noise of keyboards clattering. "Dad, I'm swamped right now, can we make this quick?" David said, and when Frank mentioned maybe trying out some solar project, his son laughed, not cruelly but dismissively, the way you might laugh if a child claimed he'd build a rocket in the backyard. "Come on, Dad, you're 67. Just enjoy retirement. Don't stress yourself with stuff like that. You don't need to prove anything." The word struck like a hammer. Frank wanted to argue, wanted to say he did need to prove something, not to the world but to himself, but instead he fell silent. They ended the call politely, but as Frank set the phone down the silence in the room thickened, pressing on his ribs. He sat there a long time, staring at Mary's picture again, her eyes bright with that look of faith she'd always given him. "They all think I'm done, Mare," he whispered, voice cracking. "Even our boy." The loneliness of that truth nearly broke him. Later, as he flipped through channels to drown out the thoughts, he landed on a replay of an interview with Elon Musk. The host asked about critics, about people who doubted his projects, and Elon smiled faintly and said, "If you're not facing skepticism, you're probably not innovating enough. The world resists change until it doesn't. You have to keep pushing." Frank froze, remote in hand, his heart thumping harder. The words felt aimed at him, cutting through the doubt like a lifeline. He remembered the windmill again, the way he gave up because of laughter. He remembered David's chuckle on the phone. He remembered Kyle's condescension at the store. And for the first time in years he felt not just sadness but defiance. He said aloud, "Maybe it's not too late." Yet doubt clawed back quickly. He thought about his stiff knees, his trembling hands, the neighbors who already joked about him talking to himself. He thought about what would happen if he tried and failed again, how foolish he would look. The inner war raged inside him, one voice saying it was over, that he had earned rest and invisibility, the other whispering that invisibility wasn't living at all. That night he couldn't sleep. He paced the living room, hands shoved in pockets, muttering back and forth like two men trapped in one body. "You'll only embarrass yourself." "But what if I don't?" "You're too old." "Then I'll prove it." At dawn he sat in the garage, the space filled with dust motes dancing in a shaft of sunlight. He stared at the old workbench where so many engines had been resurrected, tools scattered like relics of a past life. He picked up a screwdriver, turned it in his hand, and felt a memory surge, the confidence of youth, the thrill of making something work again. His chest tightened with longing. He whispered, "Mary, what do I do?" Of course no answer came, but the silence felt less heavy, almost expectant. He thought about Elon Musk's words again, about refusing to accept limits, and for a fleeting moment the war inside tilted toward hope. Still, the fear lingered. What if he tried and failed? What if David was right? What if all he did was prove the world correct, that old men were better off staying put? He slammed the screwdriver onto the bench, the clang echoing in the garage, and sank into a chair, head in his hands. "I can't do this," he muttered, but the word "can't" tasted wrong in his mouth, sour and weak, like it didn't belong to the man he used to be. He lifted his head, eyes stinging, and looked again at the sunlight spilling through the dusty window. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up, cars starting, kids waiting for buses, life moving forward. He realized the war inside him wasn't just about solar panels or bills or projects. It was about whether he was going to let himself fade or fight for relevance. And in that moment, though fear still gripped him, a small voice inside whispered the same stubborn line he'd carried all his life: "If it's broken, fix it." Maybe the broken thing wasn't the garage, or the house, or even the world. Maybe it was him. And maybe, just maybe, he still had the tools to fix it. The garage had always been Frank Dalton's kingdom, a place where grease stained the floor like battle scars and the smell of oil and metal hung thick in the air, but over the last few years it had turned into more of a mausoleum than a workshop, a silent warehouse of tools that hadn't been touched since Mary's funeral. He opened the side door one late morning, the hinges squealing in protest as though scolding him for abandoning the space, and when the sunlight slanted in through the dirty window he was startled by the sight of dust motes drifting like slow confetti, reminding him how long it had been since he really stood in this room with purpose. He ran his hand over the workbench, fingers tracing outlines left by wrenches and sockets, and for a moment he could almost hear the phantom sound of his younger self tightening bolts, radio humming classic rock, Mary's voice occasionally calling him in for dinner. But then silence swallowed the memory, and all that remained was an old man staring at his past. He thought about the electric bill again, the numbers that glared like insults, and about Elon Musk's words echoing in his head, giving power back to people. He wasn't a billionaire, wasn't an engineer from Stanford, but he knew tools, he knew patience, and he knew the satisfaction of making broken things run again. Maybe, he thought, he could start small, just small enough to see if that spark of relevance was still alive. He shuffled toward an old shelf stacked with boxes and half-forgotten projects, digging through layers of cobwebs until he found a cardboard box labeled "Odds and Ends." Inside were pieces of wire, a cracked flashlight, and an old 12-volt battery he'd once planned to repurpose. His hands shook slightly as he lifted them, not from weakness but from the thrill of possibility. "What if I built something simple," he muttered, "something just to prove I still can." He remembered seeing an ad for DIY solar kits online, small setups designed to power garden lights or charge a phone. He didn't have the kit yet, but he had scraps, and scraps were how he had started everything in his life. He grabbed the flashlight, dismantling it carefully, humming low like he used to when working. Hours slipped by as he tested wires, adjusted contacts, and cobbled together pieces that didn't quite fit but worked well enough to tease the edges of a dream. The first attempt fizzled, wires sparked, smoke curled, and he coughed as the acrid smell filled the garage. He sat back, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand, chuckling bitterly. "You're no Elon Musk, Dalton." The laughter turned hollow, but then another memory rose uninvited, Elon saying failure was an option, that if things weren't failing, they weren't ambitious enough. Frank rolled the words around in his mind, and something stubborn stirred. He'd been failing for years by doing nothing. At least this kind of failure had movement. He stood again, straightened his back, and dug deeper into the boxes. He found an old solar-powered calculator, broken but with a small panel intact, and carefully pried it loose. Piece by piece, he began cobbling together a crude solar light, splicing wires, testing connections, the rhythm of problem-solving returning to his bones like an old song he thought he'd forgotten. As the sun dipped lower, painting the garage in amber light, he stepped back to test it. He set the small contraption by the window, letting the fading sunlight charge it, then waited as dusk settled. When darkness finally crept across the yard, he held his breath and flipped the switch. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then, faint but steady, the bulb glowed. It wasn't bright, more of a dim pulse than a full shine, but to Frank it looked like the 4th of July. He laughed out loud, the sound booming against the quiet garage, startling even himself. Well, I'll be damned, he said, voice cracking with joy. His chest swelled, eyes wet, as though that little light was proof not just that the device worked but that he still worked, that the spark inside him wasn't dead after all. He carried the contraption outside, setting it in the backyard where the shadows stretched long. It cast a small circle of light on the grass, barely enough to read by, but to Frank it was a beacon, a declaration to the darkness, I am still here. He pulled a lawn chair up beside it and sat there for nearly an hour, watching the glow hold steady against the night, whispering to himself, still got it, old man. The neighbor's porch lights flicked on one by one, some glancing curiously toward Frank's yard, but he didn't care what they thought. For the first time in years he felt alive, like he was doing something that mattered. The war inside him, the doubt and the defeat, seemed quieter in the presence of that tiny glow. When he finally went inside, he placed the contraption gently on the kitchen counter, as though it were a newborn, and snapped a picture with his old phone. He didn't post it online, not yet, but he stared at the photo for a long time, considering. He whispered toward Mary's picture, you'd have laughed at how ugly it looks, but you'd have clapped anyway, wouldn't you? He imagined her nodding, eyes shining, and felt a warmth in his chest that no furnace could give. That night he slept deeper than he had in years, not because the problems were solved but because for once he felt like he was moving towards something instead of away from it. In his dreams, the windmill of his youth spun freely, blades turning strong, and no one was laughing. When morning came, the sunlight streaming through the curtains, Frank woke with a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt in a long time. He padded into the kitchen, saw the little solar light still sitting on the counter, its battery drained but its promise intact, and he smiled. The spark was real, and it was waiting for him in the garage. The next morning Frank Dalton rose before dawn, a habit he had nearly forgotten after years of sleeping in without reason, and he shuffled into the kitchen with the restless energy of a man who couldn't sit still when an idea was burning a hole through him. The little solar lamp he had built sat lifeless on the counter, its battery drained, its light extinguished, but instead of discouragement he felt something else, curiosity, the itch to see if he could make it stronger, brighter, more reliable. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, hands steady despite the excitement running through his veins, and he carried the contraption back into the garage like a soldier bringing home a trophy. The garage smelled of sawdust and rust, of a life lived long ago when projects were stacked high, and now it smelled faintly of burnt wires too. Frank set the lamp down on the bench, pulled out his old toolbox, and got to work. Hours slipped away as he tinkered, splicing wires, swapping batteries, trying to reinforce the small solar panel he had salvaged from the calculator. His first success felt like a miracle, but he knew it was a fragile one, held together by luck as much as skill. He needed to make it durable, something that wouldn't collapse the moment the weather changed or the sun dipped too quickly. The problem was, every attempt seemed to fall apart. One battery leaked acid, forcing him to throw it out with a hiss of frustration. Another attempt short-circuited, popping with a sharp crack that sent him stumbling back, heart hammering as though the whole garage might explode. He swore under his breath, the kind of language Mary used to scold him for, and yet he couldn't stop himself because the failure stung more than he expected. He had been proud of that small victory last night, and now it felt like sand slipping through his fingers. As the hours stretched into late afternoon, his hands cramped from twisting wires and his eyes burned from squinting at the tiny components, he leaned back against the workbench and muttered, maybe I was kidding myself. Maybe I don't have it anymore. He stared at the broken pieces scattered before him, little grave markers of ambition, and felt the weight of age pressing down, the reminder that he wasn't 30 anymore, wasn't even 60. The aches in his knees screamed louder than the sparks from the wires, and for a moment he considered packing it all back into the box and forgetting this foolishness. The world had moved on without him, and maybe it was time to accept that. But then his phone buzzed on the shelf where he had tossed it hours earlier. He ignored it at first, lost in his sulk, but when it buzzed again he grabbed it, more out of irritation than interest. The screen lit up with a video suggestion from YouTube, an algorithm he had never paid attention to before, and at the top of the feed was Elon Musk speaking at some event years ago. Frank nearly set the phone down again, but the title caught him. Failure is not the end, it's the beginning. Something in those words gnawed him, so he tapped it open. Elon's voice filled the garage, calm but charged with energy, saying, "If you're not failing, you're not innovating. Failure is part of the process, the way you learn what works. Every success I've ever had was built on piles of failures." Frank listened, arms crossed, jaw tight, but as the words settled in he felt the stubborn ember inside him flare again. He had been failing, yes, but that meant he was moving, didn't it? That meant he was trying. He let the video play through, Musk talking about rockets exploding, cars breaking down, companies nearly going bankrupt, and how every setback was just a step towards something greater. Frank chuckled, shaking his head. Well hell, if the man can blow up a rocket and keep going, I guess I can burn through a few batteries. Energized again, he picked up the wires, determined to keep pushing. He worked until his hands were black with grease, until his back ached from leaning over the bench, and though he didn't crack the problem that night, he didn't give up either. He left the garage with a mess of failed attempts, but instead of feeling defeated he felt oddly proud. He had survived the first real test, the point where the old Frank would have quit, and he hadn't quit. That night he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the small photo of Mary he kept near the salt shaker, and whispered, "You'd be laughing at me right now, wouldn't you? Cussing at wires like I'm 20 again." He imagined her smile, imagined her saying, "Keep at it, Frankie. You never did like easy things." He went to bed tired but satisfied, the kind of tired that came from working towards something, not just passing time. Over the next week the failures stacked up higher. One panel cracked when he tried to mount it on an old garden stake. Another fried completely when he connected the wrong polarity. The lamp that had once glowed so beautifully refused to shine again no matter how he coaxed it. Yet each failure seemed to chip away at his fear instead of his resolve. He began to notice a rhythm in the mistakes, small lessons hidden in each breakdown. He kept a notebook, scribbling crude diagrams, writing down what didn't work so he wouldn't repeat it. His handwriting was shaky, the letters sprawling across the page, but it felt good to record his efforts, to treat them like they mattered. By the end of the week, the garage looked like a battlefield, broken plastic, twisted wires, half-burned batteries. But in the center of it all was Frank, grinning more often than cursing, alive in the chaos. One evening, after another frustrating attempt ended in a dead bulb, he carried the pieces into the backyard and sat in the dark, staring up at the stars. He thought of the times he had sat there with Mary, watching meteor showers, telling their son about constellations, and he realized something startling: he wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. Not the literal dark, not the metaphorical kind that had haunted him since retirement. The failures hadn't beaten him down, they had made him realize he still had fight left. "You old fool," he muttered, smiling at the night sky. "You're failing your way forward." The next morning he ordered his first real solar kit online, clicking "Purchase" with a thrill he hadn't felt since buying his first truck decades ago. It wasn't expensive, just a starter set meant for hobbyists, but to him it was an investment in possibility. As he closed the laptop, he felt lighter, like the failures of the past week had cleared the path for something new. He thought again of Elon's words, "Failure isn't the end, it's the beginning," and whispered to himself, "Then let's see where the beginning takes me." The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, a plain brown box left on Frank Dalton's porch like an unspoken invitation. He almost didn't hear the delivery man set it down, lost in the hum of his morning routine, coffee, toast, staring out at the gray sky, but the knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. He opened it to find the box sitting there with his name scrawled across the label, and for a moment he just stood, staring as though it were a letter from another life. His hands trembled slightly as he carried it inside, setting it carefully on the kitchen table. He sliced the tape open with his pocketknife and peeled back the cardboard, and there it was, his first real solar kit. It wasn't fancy, just a beginner's set with small panels, connectors, and an instruction manual thick with diagrams, but to Frank it might as well have been a treasure chest. He lifted the panel, surprisingly light, and felt a surge of pride that he had taken this step, that he had invested in something instead of just dreaming about it. He set the pieces out across the table, arranging them like puzzle parts, and began reading the manual with the intensity of a man preparing for battle. Hours passed as he studied, scribbling notes in his notebook, his mind buzzing with possibilities. He could power his garage lights, maybe even a small fan. If it worked, maybe he could cut his bill down, just a little. But more than that, he felt part of something bigger, like he wasn't just tinkering for himself but contributing to a larger fight, against age, against irrelevance, against the notion that the world had no place left for men like him. He was so deep in focus that when the phone rang, it startled him enough to knock over his coffee, sending a dark river across the instructions. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing paper towels, but the phone kept ringing, its shrill tone tugging at him. He wiped his hands and picked it up. The caller ID froze him, his son, Michael. They hadn't spoken in months, maybe longer, their relationship strained by years of silence and misunderstandings. Frank swallowed hard and pressed answer. "Hello." His voice cracked more than he intended. "Dad?" Michael's voice was cautious, tentative, as though reaching across a chasm. "Yeah, it's me. What's going on?" Frank asked, bracing himself. I was just thinking about you. Wanted to check in." The words hit Frank like a jolt. Michael had never been one for casual calls, not since Mary passed. Their conversations had turned into arguments more often than not, about Frank's health, his stubbornness, his refusal to move in with family. "I'm fine," Frank said quickly, too quickly. "Just keeping busy." There was a pause on the line, filled with static and unspoken words. "Busy?" Michael finally asked, curiosity edging into his tone. Frank glanced at the solar kit spread across the table. Part of him wanted to brush it off, to avoid sounding foolish, but another part wanted to share, to bridge the gap with something real. "Yeah," Frank said slowly. "I've been working on something. Solar panels. Just a small project, nothing big." Silence again, and then Michael chuckled softly. "Solar panels? You? That's unexpected." Frank bristled, hearing skepticism in his son's laugh, but he forced himself to breathe. "Yeah, well, figured it was time I tried something new. Can't just sit around waiting for the world to end." Michael's voice softened. "I didn't mean it like that, Dad. I'm surprised, that's all. But, good for you. Honestly. I'm glad you've got something." The words warmed Frank in a way he didn't expect. For years he had felt judged by his son, dismissed as stubborn, outdated, but now there was a hint of respect in Michael's tone, like maybe this small step mattered to more than just Frank. They talked for a few more minutes, awkward but genuine, about Michael's kids, about the weather, about little things that filled the spaces between heavier truths. When they hung up, Frank sat in the quiet kitchen, staring at the phone in his hand, and realized his chest felt lighter. The call hadn't solved everything, but it had cracked the door open, letting in just enough light to remind him that reconciliation wasn't impossible. He turned back to the kit with renewed determination. The next few days were a blur of trial and error, his garage once again alive with the sound of tools and muttered curses. He mounted the panels on a wooden frame, connected the wires, tested the current with an old multimeter. He failed often, panels tilted wrong, connections loose. But each mistake felt less like a setback and more like a lesson. He stayed up late, sometimes past midnight, sketching diagrams in his notebook, his handwriting growing steadier as his confidence grew. One evening, after hours of fiddling, he finally got a small fan running, its blades whirring gently as it drew power from the sun. Frank laughed out loud, clapping his hands like a boy at a fair. He sat in the garage, letting the fan cool his face, and thought of Michael. Maybe one day he could show him this, prove that he wasn't just wasting away. Maybe one day they could build something together. That night he called Michael back, surprising even himself. "Hey," he said when his son answered. "Remember that project I told you about? It's working. Got a fan running off sunlight." There was silence, then a genuine laugh. "That's amazing, Dad. Really. I'm proud of you." Frank's throat tightened. It had been years since he'd heard those words. "Thanks, son," he whispered. "Means a lot." After they hung up, Frank sat in the dark garage with the fan still whirring, tears streaming silently down his face. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man living in the shadow of loss. He felt like a man building something new, something that might outlast him. He whispered toward Mary's picture taped above the bench, "We're getting there, love. One panel at a time." Frank Dalton didn't set out to attract attention. He had spent most of his later years trying to fade into the background, the quiet old man at the end of Maplewood Lane who mowed his lawn slower than he used to and waved politely at neighbors but never lingered long enough for real conversation. But something had shifted since the day he powered that little fan with sunlight. Now, each morning, he rolled up the garage door and dragged out his wooden frame of solar panels, setting them up in the yard to catch the strongest rays. He kept his notebook close, recording voltage readings and scribbling adjustments, his brow furrowed in concentration. At first, the neighbors barely noticed. They had grown used to Frank's quirks, his endless tinkering, the way he still polished his 30-year-old pickup even though it hadn't left the driveway in months. But as the days passed and the panels grew sturdier, as wires stretched across his yard and the faint whir of his solar-powered fan could be heard on hot afternoons, curiosity began to spread like ripples in water. Mrs. Henderson from across the street was the first to ask. She was out watering her roses one morning when she called over, "What on earth are you building there, Frank?" He looked up from his work, wiping sweat from his forehead, and for the first time in years he didn't feel embarrassed about being seen. Trying to catch the sun, he said with a grin, surprising even himself with the poetry of it. She laughed, shaking her head, but later he noticed her peeking again from her porch, watching as the fan spun steadily. A few days later, the Jenkins kids rode their bikes down the street and skidded to a stop near his driveway. "Is that, like, a robot?" the younger one asked, eyes wide. Frank chuckled. "Not a robot. Solar panels. They turn sunlight into electricity." The boy tilted his head, squinting. "Like Iron Man?" "Sort of," Frank said, amused. "But a lot less flashy." They rode off laughing, but Frank noticed how they kept looking back, pointing and whispering. Word spread. Soon neighbors slowed their cars as they passed his house, glancing at the strange contraption gleaming in the yard. Some looked skeptical, others curious, but all of them noticed. Frank tried not to let it get to him, but part of him swelled with pride. For so long he had felt invisible, a relic people overlooked, but now his little project was sparking whispers. One afternoon, while adjusting the angle of the panels, Frank overheard two men walking their dogs muttering as they passed. "What's old Dalton up to now?" one asked. "Looks like some kind of science project." "Midlife crisis, 40 years late," the other chuckled. Frank stiffened, pretending not to hear, but the words dug into him. He fought the urge to retreat, to roll the garage door shut and hide from the eyes of the neighborhood. That had been his instinct for too long, to withdraw when judged, to shrink when mocked. But then he thought of Elon's words again, failure and ridicule as necessary companions on the road to progress, and he straightened his back, adjusting the panel with deliberate care. "Let them laugh," he muttered under his breath. "The sun doesn't care." That evening, as the panels soaked up the last rays, he sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea and watched the light fade. He could hear distant conversations drifting through the air, neighbors chatting about dinners and chores, but every now and then he caught fragments about Frank's solar thing. He realized something startling: for the first time in years, he was part of their conversations. Maybe not yet respected, maybe not yet understood, but noticed. And being noticed after so many years of silence felt like oxygen. The next weekend, his neighbor Daniel, retired Air Force, stern but fair, walked over while Frank was testing a new wiring connection. Daniel leaned on the fence, arms crossed. "Heard you're building a power plant over here," he said with a smirk. Frank laughed nervously. "Not quite. Just a little experiment." Daniel nodded slowly. "Looks better than an experiment to me. Panels are lined up neat, fan runs steady. You figuring all this out yourself?" "Mostly," Frank admitted. "Just a kit I bought, some trial and error. Trying to see if an old man's brain still works." Daniel's smirk softened into a smile. "Well, looks like it does. Hell, maybe I should get one of those for my shed. My AC bill's killing me." The word struck Frank like a lightning bolt. Someone real, someone his age, had just admitted that his work might be useful. Not a joke, not a curiosity, but a possibility. He nodded, hiding the grin that threatened to spill across his face. "Maybe I could show you how it works sometime." "I'd like that," Daniel said, giving him a respectful nod before walking back across the street. That night Frank sat in the garage staring at the panels, his mind racing. For months he had thought this project was just about proving something to himself, about surviving the loneliness and the weight of age. But what if it could be more? What if the whispers in the neighborhood weren't just gossip, but the first tremors of something bigger, connection, community, maybe even purpose? He imagined helping Daniel set up a panel, showing Mrs. Henderson how her roses could be lit at night without costing her a dime, teaching the Jenkins kids about energy from the sun. The thought filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt since coaching Little League decades ago, when the kids had looked up to him with trust in their eyes. For the first time since Mary's death, Frank felt the tug of belonging. Still, not everyone was kind. A week later, while carrying groceries in from the truck, he overheard a teenager mutter to his friend as they passed, "Crazy old man thinks he's Elon Musk." They both laughed, and Frank's jaw tightened. He wanted to shout back, to defend himself, but instead he carried the bags inside in silence, the words echoing in his head. Crazy old man. The insult stung, not because it was new but because it was the label he had feared for years, that his efforts, his dreams, were just foolishness. But as he set the groceries down, his eyes fell on the small fan still running in the garage, powered by sunlight, steady and real. The laughter outside faded in importance. He whispered to himself, better a crazy old man building something than a quiet old man fading away. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the crickets outside, and realized the whispers, good and bad, were proof that he had stirred the water. He had made ripples. And ripples, given time, could become waves. He smiled into the dark, hearing Mary's voice in his memory, teasing him, "You always did like causing a stir, Frankie." He whispered back, "Yeah, but this time it's for something that matters." And with that thought, he drifted into sleep, dreaming not of endings but of beginnings, of sunlight spilling across rooftops and neighbors gathering in his yard, not to whisper but to learn. The first storm of summer rolled in without warning, sweeping across Maplewood Lane with a fury that rattled windows and bent tree branches like brittle straws. Frank Dalton had been in the garage that afternoon, hunched over his notebook and wiring diagrams, when the wind began to howl through the cracked door. At first he thought it would pass quickly, just another passing squall, but when he heard the metallic clatter of something toppling in the yard, his heart dropped. He pushed open the garage door and froze. His solar panels, his pride, his daily ritual, the fragile scaffolding of purpose that had brought him back to life, were shuddering in the gale, the wooden frame rocking dangerously. Rain whipped across the yard, hammering the panels like 1,000 tiny fists, and he could see wires snapping loose, flapping wildly in the wind. "No, no, no," he muttered, sprinting out into the storm. His body protested with every step, knees aching, back screaming, but adrenaline drowned the pain. He grabbed the frame just as it began to tip, the weight of it nearly dragging him down into the mud. He braced his legs and held on, rain soaking him to the bone, lightning flashing overhead. For a moment he was back in the Navy, clutching a lifeline on a pitching deck, the ocean roaring all around, but this was no memory, this was now, and it was his future trying to be ripped away. Not today, he growled through clenched teeth, gripping tighter. But the storm was stronger than his arms, and with a sickening crack, the frame splintered. The panels slid sideways, crashing to the ground, shards of glass spraying like ice across the lawn. Frank stumbled to his knees, chest heaving, as the rain pounded him mercilessly. He stared at the wreckage, wires torn, connectors dangling, his fan knocked over and broken, and something inside him cracked with it. By the time the storm passed an hour later, the yard looked like a battlefield. Branches littered the grass, mud pooled around the driveway, and in the middle of it all lay the ruined remains of his solar project. Frank stood in silence, water dripping from his hair, clothes clinging heavy to his skin. His hands shook as he bent down, picking up one of the shattered panels. The glass cut into his palm, a sharp sting, but he didn't flinch. He felt hollow, like the storm had taken not just his project but the fragile hope he had been nursing. He carried the broken pieces into the garage and laid them gently on the workbench, as if they were bodies in need of burial. Then he sat heavily on his old stool, head in his hands, and for the first time in months, the darkness pressed in again. His mind whispered the old, poisonous thoughts, "You're too old for this. What were you thinking? You can't fight the world, can't fight time. You're just a foolish old man playing scientist." He stayed there for hours, staring at the mess, the garage growing darker as night fell. When the phone rang, he ignored it. When the neighbors knocked to check on him after the storm, he stayed silent, pretending not to hear. He felt himself sinking back into the same shadow he had escaped, and the thought terrified him. That night, he barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the panels crashing down again, heard the laughter of those teenagers calling him crazy, saw the pity in his son's eyes when he would eventually have to admit he had failed. By dawn, he sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, staring out at the wreckage in the yard. He thought about throwing it all away, about packing the pieces into the trash and forgetting this foolish chapter. Maybe it was enough that he had tried, enough that he had felt alive for a little while. Maybe he didn't deserve more. But then, as the first sunlight broke through the clouds, it glinted off the broken glass in the yard, scattering little rainbows across the grass. Frank blinked, caught off guard by the beauty of it. Even broken, even ruined, the panels were still catching the light, still reflecting something back into the world. He felt a lump rise in his throat. Maybe broken didn't mean finished. He thought of Elon Musk again, of rockets exploding on launch pads, of factories going bankrupt, of the ridicule that had followed every bold attempt, and of how Elon had kept going anyway. Failure wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Frank stood slowly, his joints creaking, but his resolve hardening. He pulled on his old work gloves, grabbed a broom, and stepped out into the yard. The neighbors peeked from their windows as he worked, gathering shards of glass, coiling up wires, dragging the splintered frame back into the garage. Some probably thought he was crazy, salvaging wreckage instead of giving up, but Frank no longer cared. This wasn't about them. This was about proving to himself that storms, literal or otherwise, wouldn't be the end of him. By noon, he had cleared the yard, and the workbench was piled with broken parts. He sat down, sweat dripping, and whispered, "All right. Let's see what can be saved." For days he worked like a man possessed, testing each piece, discarding what was truly destroyed, setting aside what might be repaired. His notebook filled with new sketches, new ideas for sturdier frames, better anchors, waterproof casings. The storm had wrecked his project, yes, but it had also revealed the flaws, the weaknesses he hadn't considered. If he rebuilt, he would rebuild stronger. One evening, while he was hunched over the bench soldering a connector, his phone buzzed again. This time he answered, not realizing until too late that it was Michael. "Dad? You okay? I heard about the storm up there." Frank hesitated, glancing at the mess around him. He wanted to lie, to say everything was fine, but the truth pushed out instead. Lost it all, son. Panels smashed. Everything's a mess. There was silence, then Michael sighed. I'm sorry, Dad. That must hurt. Yeah, Frank said softly. It does. But then he added, surprising himself, I'm not done yet. I'm going to rebuild. He expected Michael to laugh, to dismiss it, but instead his son's voice was quiet, thoughtful. You know, that's exactly what Mom would have said. Frank's throat tightened, his eyes burning. For a moment he couldn't speak. Finally, he whispered, yeah. She wouldn't have let me quit. They talked a little longer, more easily than before, and when they hung up, Frank felt lighter. The storm had tried to take everything, but it had given him something too, a chance to show resilience, to prove not just to himself but to his son that he still had fight. That night, lying in bed, he thought about the future, not as a dwindling clock, but as a landscape waiting to be built. He imagined sturdier panels gleaming in the sun, neighbors gathered in his yard not to whisper but to ask for help, his son standing beside him with pride instead of pity. He whispered into the darkness, you were wrong, storm. You didn't end me. You started me. And with that, Frank fell into the deepest, most determined sleep he had known in years, dreaming not of ruin but of rebuilding. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days after the storm settled into a rhythm that felt both punishing and strangely invigorating, a cycle of sweat, aching muscles, and stubborn resolve. Frank Dalton rose each morning before the sun fully cleared the tree-line, a cup of black coffee warming his hands as he looked out over the yard where the storm had left its scars. The ground was still soft with mud, the grass flattened in ragged swirls, and scattered in the dirt were a few tiny shards of glass he hadn't yet found. They sparkled faintly in the early light, reminders of what had been lost, but also sparks of what could be remade. He set the mug down and pulled on his gloves, stepping out into the cool morning air with the slow but steady gait of a man carrying both years and purpose. The garage had become his sanctuary, cluttered with salvaged parts, scribbled diagrams, and stacks of tools that he hadn't touched this often in decades. Each broken piece told him a story, wires torn because he hadn't secured them tightly enough, frames snapped because the wood wasn't strong enough, seals leaking because he hadn't accounted for heavy rain. At first, those mistakes gnawed at him, whispering that he wasn't cut out for this, that he was trying to play at being an engineer long after the world had passed him by. But each evening, as he sketched out better designs in his notebook, those whispers quieted. Mistakes weren't failures. They were blueprints for resilience. He remembered Elon Musk's words he had once scribbled on a sticky note and taped above the workbench, failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough. Frank read it every time doubt threatened to settle in, letting the words anchor him like a hand gripping his shoulder. Slowly, the rebuild took shape. He drove to the hardware store and loaded the truck with stronger lumber, waterproof sealant, and reinforced brackets. The young clerk raised his eyebrows as Frank hauled the heavy supplies alone, sweat beading across his forehead, but Frank only smiled through the strain. Let them doubt. Doubt had fueled him before, and it would fuel him again. In the evenings, neighbors sometimes strolled by, slowing down as they passed the open garage door. Some gave polite nods, others lingered with curiosity, and a few even asked tentative questions. Frank didn't offer much at first, still guarding his fragile momentum, but as the days passed, he found himself explaining what he was building, how the panels could harness sunlight even in a small town like theirs, how batteries could store power for nights and storms. To his surprise, people listened. They didn't scoff or call him crazy. They asked how much it might cost, whether it could help them with their rising electric bills. He realized he wasn't just rebuilding for himself anymore. The project had begun as a personal resurrection, but now it was starting to ripple outward. On the 10th day, his son Michael called again. Dad, I've been thinking about what you said, Michael began, his voice cautious. About rebuilding. Frank wiped sweat from his brow, holding the phone between his ear and shoulder while tightening a bracket. Yeah. Still at it. Stronger this time. Michael hesitated, then said, you know, I've got some vacation time next week. Maybe I could drive up, give you a hand. Frank froze, his heart hammering. For years, he had carried the weight of silence, of distance, of words unsaid between them. Now, for the first time, Michael wasn't calling out of obligation but out of choice. I'd like that, Frank said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I'd like that a lot. The following week, when Michael's car pulled into the driveway, Frank stood a little taller, wiping his hands on his jeans as his son stepped out. Michael looked older than Frank remembered, streaks of gray in his hair, lines at the corners of his eyes, but his presence filled the yard with an energy Frank hadn't felt in years. They shook hands, then hugged awkwardly, the kind of embrace that carried both years of distance and the possibility of something new. For 2 days they worked side by side, hauling wood, tightening bolts, lifting frames into place. Michael brought fresh ideas from his background in construction, suggesting stronger joints, better angles, ways to anchor the panels more securely. Frank listened, sometimes swallowing his pride, sometimes amazed at how much his son knew. At night, they sat at the kitchen table eating simple meals, grilled cheese, canned soup, and for the first time in a long time, they talked. Not just about the project, but about Michael's kids, about old family vacations, about the things they both missed since Frank's wife had passed. There were pauses heavy with unspoken regret, but also laughter that eased the weight. On the third day, as they lifted the new frame into place, Frank's back gave a sharp protest. He winced, staggering slightly, and Michael immediately reached out. Dad, let me take it. You don't have to prove anything. Frank leaned on the frame, breathing hard, sweat dripping down his temples. I'm not proving anything, son. I'm just, not done yet. Michael held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Together, they finished securing the frame, the panels gleaming under the afternoon sun. When they stepped back, Frank felt a surge of pride unlike anything he'd known in years. The panels weren't perfect, but they stood solid, resilient, ready to face the next storm. That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long golden rays across the yard, Frank and Michael sat on the porch with cold beers, watching the panels catch the fading light. Michael took a sip and said quietly, Mom would have loved this, you know. Frank's throat tightened, and he nodded, eyes stinging. Yeah. She would have. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the hollow ache of absence. He felt presence, her spirit woven into the work, into the bond being rebuilt with his son, into the light that would soon power not just his home but maybe others too. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. People stopped by to see the panels, to ask questions, to marvel at the idea of energy pulled straight from the sun. Some were skeptical, sure, but others leaned in, curiosity bright in their eyes. Frank realized he had become something he never expected, a teacher, a spark for others his age who had long felt powerless in the face of rising bills and shrinking possibilities. He told them the truth, that it was hard work, that storms would come, that sometimes things would break. But also that it was possible, even for someone like him, someone written off as too old, too tired, too late. By the end of the month, the system hummed to life. The panels fed power into the batteries, lights flickered on in the garage without pulling from the grid, and Frank stood there with Michael at his side, both of them grinning like boys who had just built their first treehouse. You did it, Dad, Michael said, clapping him on the shoulder. Frank shook his head. We did it. That night, lying in bed, Frank felt something shift deep inside. The rebuild wasn't just about panels or wires or storms. It was about him, about reclaiming the right to begin again, about proving that age was not a chain but a chapter. He whispered into the darkness, not to the storm this time but to himself, You're not done. You're just getting started. And for the first time in years, sleep came easy, carrying him into dreams not of endings but of beginnings yet to come. The morning it happened was like any other, or at least it began that way. Frank Dalton rose early, his body stiff but his mind alert, the quiet hum of possibility tugging him out of bed before the alarm clock could. The air carried the faint crispness of late summer, warm but edged with coolness that hinted at fall waiting just around the corner. He brewed his coffee, black and strong, then stood by the kitchen window, gazing out at the solar panels that gleamed like soldiers ready for inspection. They looked different now, not fragile experiments cobbled together by an old man chasing a dream, but sturdy, confident structures standing tall in the yard. Frank sipped his coffee slowly, watching the first beams of sunlight stretch across the horizon. He felt a tremor in his chest, half fear and half hope. Today the system would be tested in full. For weeks he and Michael had worked, tweaking circuits, balancing the load, fine-tuning the battery storage. The system had powered the garage and a few lights here and there, but today it would carry the entire house. Today was the moment when vision turned into reality, when light would be drawn down from the sky and fed directly into the veins of his home. He set the mug down, pulled on his gloves, and stepped outside. Michael was already in the yard, crouched by the inverter with a wrench in hand, his hair mussed from lack of sleep. He glanced up with a tired grin. "You ready, Dad?" Frank nodded, his throat tight. They had checked everything twice, then 3 times. Still, doubt clung to him like mist. What if the wiring failed? What if the batteries overheated? What if this whole thing, this months-long labor of sweat and will, turned out to be nothing more than a foolish dream? He shook the thought away, forcing himself to breathe deeply. Failure was possible, yes, but so was success, and he would never know until he flipped the switch. Together they tightened the final connection, then stood side by side before the control box mounted neatly on the wall of the garage. Frank's hand hovered over the breaker. His fingers trembled, not from weakness but from the sheer weight of the moment. Michael placed a steadying hand on his father's shoulder. "Go on, Dad. This is your moment." Frank drew a breath, pressed the switch, and for a split second the world held still. Then, with a faint hum that quickly deepened into a steady thrum, the system came alive. Lights flickered on inside the house, one by one, kitchen, hallway, living room, as if the house itself were waking from a long slumber. The refrigerator buzzed to life, the garage fan whirred softly, and the little monitor screen on the wall displayed the numbers climbing, kilowatts harvested, power stored, energy flowing. Frank and Michael stood frozen, staring at the glow spilling from the windows. For a heartbeat Frank thought he was dreaming, some trick of hope playing with his tired mind. But then Michael let out a laugh, loud and unrestrained, clapping his father on the back so hard it nearly knocked him forward. "You did it. It's running, Dad. It's really running." Frank felt something swell inside him, a tide of emotion he couldn't contain. His eyes burned, and before he could stop it, tears were sliding down his weathered cheeks. He had imagined this moment so many times, in sleepless nights and quiet mornings, but the reality of it, the light glowing warm and steady from the house that had felt so dark for so long, was overwhelming. He staggered back a step, sat heavily on the porch steps, and buried his face in his hands. Michael sat beside him, their shoulders pressed together, both of them watching the panels gleam in the sun. "I told myself I was too old," Frank whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "That it was too late. But look at it, son. Look at what we did." Michael's arm slipped around his father's shoulders, pulling him close. "Mom would have said the same thing I'm about to say. It was never too late. Not for you." They sat there for a long time, watching the sunlight pour down into the panels, watching the numbers on the monitor rise steadily like proof of resurrection. Neighbors began to gather at the edge of the driveway, drawn by the glow from the windows and the sound of machines running on nothing but the sun itself. Mrs. Callahan from across the street clutched her cardigan tighter, eyes wide. "Is it true?" she called. You're running your house off the sun. Frank rose slowly, wiping his face with his sleeve, and nodded. It's true. Come see for yourself. Soon the yard was filled with people, voices buzzing with amazement and curiosity. They crowded into the garage, peering at the control box, marveling at the screen that showed how much power had already been stored. Could this work for my place? Someone asked. What about during storms? Another added. Frank answered each question with patience, his voice steady, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in years, relevance. These people weren't humoring him. They weren't patting him on the head or calling him crazy. They were listening, really listening, as if what he had built mattered not just to him but to all of them. And in that moment, Frank realized something profound. This wasn't just about light bulbs glowing or refrigerators humming. This was about hope, about proving that renewal was possible not only for homes but for hearts, not only for power grids but for lives that had grown dim. As the sun climbed higher, the panels continued their steady harvest, the numbers ticking upward. The house remained aglow, humming along, a living testament to persistence. Frank felt lighter than he had in decades, as if the weight of years had lifted. He looked at Michael, who stood with his arms crossed, smiling proudly, and felt the gap between them close like a wound finally healing. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed and the yard quieted, Frank and Michael sat once more on the porch, the soft golden light of the solar-powered lamps bathing them in warmth. Fireflies blinked lazily in the grass, and the air smelled of cut hay from the nearby fields. Frank sipped his beer, savoring the moment. You know, he said slowly, this isn't just about me anymore. This could help people, real people struggling with bills, folks on fixed incomes. It could change things, even if just a little. Michael nodded. It already has, Dad. Look around. You gave the neighbors something to believe in. And you gave yourself something too. Frank thought of all the nights he had sat in the dark, weighed down by loneliness and regret, convinced his best days were behind him. He thought of the storm that had nearly destroyed everything, the voice in his head that had whispered it was over. And then he thought of the light now flowing through his house, steady and strong, born of nothing but the sun and his refusal to give up. Funny thing about light, Frank murmured, half to himself. You think it's gone, but it's always waiting. You just need the right way to catch it. He leaned back, closing his eyes, the warmth of the day lingering on his skin, and for the first time in years, he felt not old, not broken, not forgotten. He felt alive, renewed, like a man not at the end of something but at the beginning. And as darkness finally fell, the lights in his home shone bright and steady, proof that even in the autumn of life, dawn could come again. The glow of Frank Dalton's solar-powered house lingered like a beacon over Maplewood Lane, casting a golden halo that neighbors spoke about in grocery aisles and whispered about at the post office. For a few weeks, life seemed to shimmer with promise, each morning marked by the steady hum of energy harvested from the sun, each evening filled with the warm satisfaction of lamps glowing without fear of an overdue bill. But just as the sun rises, clouds eventually gather, and with light comes shadow. Word spread beyond Maplewood, carried on gossip, social media, and the curiosity of those who couldn't believe an old man in his 60s had done what corporations and politicians only argued about. At first, it was flattering. Local reporters showed up, snapping photos of Frank standing proudly beside his panels, his son Michael in the background tightening bolts. Articles appeared with headlines like, "Retired Veteran Powers Home with Homemade Solar Grid," and "Grandfather Turns Sunlight into Survival." Frank clipped one and pinned it to his refrigerator, feeling a spark of boyish pride each time he passed. But the attention also drew voices less kind, voices that remembered the old Frank, the man hunched over in his garage muttering to himself, the one kids mocked as crazy. They resurfaced like weeds after rain. At the diner one morning, Frank overheard a pair of men at the counter chuckling over the article. "Sure, it's cute," one said, stirring his coffee. "Old man Dalton playing Elon Musk in his backyard. But it won't last. Next storm and those panels will be in pieces again." The other snorted. "Yeah, And when the batteries catch fire, he'll be begging the utility company to come turn his lights back on. Waste of time if you ask me. Frank sat silently in his booth, the words sinking like stones in his gut. He had fought through storms, sweat, and loneliness to bring light back into his life, and still they laughed, still they doubted. That night, lying awake, he heard their voices echoing with the same tone his own inner critic used to carry: foolish. Too old. Delusional. The next day, a letter arrived from the town council. It was written in stiff, formal language, noting concerns about the safety and legality of unlicensed solar installations, and requesting that Frank cease operation until proper permits and inspections are secured. Frank read it twice, his hands trembling. The project had given him life again, but now it was threatened not by storms of nature but by storms of bureaucracy. Michael found him staring at the letter in the garage, his face pale. "They're saying we need permits," Frank muttered. "Inspections, fees. I don't even know if I can afford it." Michael frowned, taking the letter. "Don't let this stop you, Dad. You've come too far." "They'll shut me down," Frank whispered. "After everything, they'll take it away." For 2 days, he sank into silence, barely eating, barely speaking, the lights glowing in his home like a cruel reminder of what could be lost. The neighbors noticed. Mrs. Callahan brought over pie, setting it gently on the porch, her eyes full of worry. A younger man down the street, whose bills had doubled that month, stopped by to ask about solar panels of his own, but Frank waved him off. The weight of doubt pressed down, heavier than before. One evening, as rain tapped softly on the roof, Frank sat in his recliner staring at the flickering screen of his old laptop. He pulled up a video of Elon Musk speaking at a conference years ago. Elon's voice filled the room, calm yet fierce: "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Frank leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, listening as if those words were meant for him alone. His breath slowed, his shoulders steadied. He wasn't done. The doubters had always been there, from the kids who mocked him to the men at the diner, from the storm that tore down his panels to the council letter now pinned to his fridge. But doubt was not destiny. Doubt was the background noise of every person who had ever dared to do something new. The next morning, Frank drove into town. He walked into the council office, his hat in his hands, and spoke with the clerk about permits, inspections, fees. The numbers made his stomach twist, more than he had in savings, more than he could manage alone. But as he left the office, he passed a bulletin board cluttered with flyers: bake sales, church picnics, yard services. An idea flickered, fragile but insistent. That night he called Michael. "What if I don't do this alone? What if it's not just about me?" Michael listened, then said, "You mean, for the neighbors?" "For everyone," Frank replied, his eyes shining. "We could build something bigger than my yard. A community project. Solar for the whole block. Maybe people would chip in, maybe we'd raise the fees together." Michael was silent for a moment, then said, "That's actually a great idea, Dad." It started small. Frank drew up a simple flyer on his old computer, printed 20 copies, and walked door to door. Community Solar Night, the flyer read. Learn how we can power Maplewood with clean, affordable energy. The first evening, only 6 people showed up at his garage, sitting on mismatched folding chairs while Frank nervously explained how solar worked, how panels could cut bills, how they could build something stronger together. But by the end of the night, those 6 people clapped, asked questions, and promised to spread the word. By the third meeting, 20 chairs weren't enough. People stood in the driveway, listening intently as Frank pointed to his panels, his voice growing more confident each time. Some doubted still, of course, but others leaned forward with real hunger in their eyes, the hunger of people tired of being at the mercy of bills and blackouts, the hunger of people who wanted to believe change was possible. And through it all, the doubters kept buzzing, letters to the editor mocking him, old acquaintances rolling their eyes, whispers about crazy Dalton with his backyard science project. But the louder they buzzed, the stronger Frank stood. He had already faced storms worse than words, and the light in his home glowed proof against every sneer. One night, after the meeting ended and the last neighbor drifted home, Frank and Michael stood alone under the soft glow of the porch light. Michael turned to his father and said, "You know, the doubters, they're not really about you. They're scared. Scared of change, scared of being wrong. But you're showing them something they can't unsee." Frank nodded slowly, the truth of it settling deep. The doubters had returned, yes. But so had something stronger, the quiet courage to keep going, to turn doubt into fuel, to build not just for himself but for everyone watching. And as he looked out at the panels glistening under the moonlight, Frank felt no anger toward the skeptics, no bitterness for their laughter. He felt only a steady resolve, like the hum of energy flowing through his wires. The doubters would always be there, but so would the light, and he knew now which one he would follow. It began with a whisper and grew into a chorus, a subtle shift that Frank Dalton could feel in the air like the slow turning of seasons. At first, his neighbors came to his garage meetings out of curiosity, some even out of pity, watching the old man with tired eyes and oil-stained hands talk about sunlight like it was salvation. But something happened each time they gathered, something small, like a spark jumping between wires. They started leaning in, asking questions not with skepticism but with hope. Mrs. Callahan, who had lived across the street since before Frank's kids were born, raised her hand one evening. "Frank," she said, her voice quivering but strong, "my heating bill nearly broke me last winter. Do you think solar could keep me from choosing between food and warmth this year?" Frank swallowed hard, meeting her gaze. "Yes," he said simply. "That's exactly what it can do." Murmurs spread through the crowd, and he could see it in their faces, the realization that this wasn't just an old man's experiment but a possibility for them all. Soon others spoke up. A young couple with a newborn asked if panels could power an air conditioner during heat waves. A retired teacher wanted to know if her roof could handle the weight. A single mother worried about blackouts during storms. Each time, Frank answered with patience, sometimes admitting he didn't know but promising to find out. His honesty, far from weakening him, only seemed to strengthen the trust growing in that garage. Within weeks, the meetings spilled out into the driveway, cars parked up and down Maplewood Lane, neighbors carrying folding chairs and pitchers of lemonade, kids playing tag under the watchful eyes of their parents. The hum of conversation filled the evenings, a sense of shared purpose binding them together. Frank would stand before them, his hands stained with grease, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who had seen the darkness and chosen the light. "This isn't just about panels and wires," he told them one night as the sunset painted the sky in gold and crimson. "It's about taking back power, literally and figuratively. It's about proving we're not too old, not too small, not too forgotten to matter." The crowd erupted in applause, and Frank felt a shiver run through him. He had spent years believing his voice no longer carried weight, that the world had moved on without him. Now here he was, leading a movement on his very street. Michael watched it all with quiet amazement. One night after the meeting, he pulled Frank aside. "Dad, do you realize what you're doing? You're not just building panels anymore. You're building community." Frank chuckled softly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Never thought I'd be a preacher at this age." "You're more than that," Michael said, his eyes shining with pride. "You're giving people hope." Word spread beyond Maplewood. Folks from neighboring streets began showing up, curious to see the panels, to hear the old man speak. A local church offered its basement for bigger gatherings, and soon the garage meetings turned into full-blown town halls. Frank stood before audiences of 50, then 100, his voice steady as he explained how solar worked, how it could save money, how it could give them independence. The doubters still lingered, muttering in corners, but their voices were drowned out by the growing chorus of belief. One Saturday, Frank woke to find a group of teenagers knocking on his door. At first, he braced for mockery, but instead they held out toolboxes and said, "Mr. Dalton, we want to help." He stared at them, stunned, then broke into a grin. "Well, grab some gloves," he said. "We've got work to do." That day, the yard buzzed with life. Kids hauling lumber, parents tightening bolts, neighbors laughing as they shared sandwiches and lemonade. It felt like an old-fashioned barn raising, except instead of walls they were building a future powered by sunlight. Frank moved among them, guiding, teaching, sometimes simply watching with tears in his eyes. For years he had felt invisible, a relic collecting dust in his own home. Now he was the center of something alive, something that pulsed with purpose. That night, exhausted but exhilarated, Frank sat on the porch with Michael, the sound of crickets filling the warm air. The panels gleamed under the moonlight, but what shone even brighter was the bond forged among his neighbors. "You see it, don't you?" Michael said quietly. "They believe now. You started something real." Frank nodded slowly, the weight of it sinking in. "I just wanted to prove I wasn't done. I never imagined." He trailed off, gesturing toward the houses where lights glowed warmly, not just from electricity but from a new sense of connection. "This isn't just about me anymore." In the weeks that followed, momentum built like a rising tide. Families pooled money to buy shared equipment. Retired electricians volunteered to inspect wiring. A local carpenter offered to build frames at cost. Even the skeptical council members began to soften, attending meetings and asking questions with less suspicion and more genuine curiosity. The project grew beyond one house, beyond one man's stubborn dream. It became Maplewood Solar, a grassroots movement that promised not just lower bills but dignity, independence, and proof that even ordinary people could change the rules. One evening, as Frank addressed the largest crowd yet in the church basement, he paused mid-sentence, overcome by the sight before him, rows of faces young and old, black and white, rich and poor, all united by a shared belief in possibility. His voice caught as he said, "I thought my best days were behind me. But standing here tonight, I know they're not. And neither are yours." The room erupted in cheers, and Frank felt the tears come, not of sorrow but of pure gratitude. Later, as he walked home under the stars, Michael at his side, Frank whispered, "Do you feel it? The shift?" Michael smiled. "Yeah, Dad. I think the whole town feels it." For the first time in decades, Maplewood Lane wasn't just a street. It was a movement, a place where ordinary people discovered extraordinary power, not just from the sun, but from each other. And at the center of it all was Frank Dalton, the old man who refused to quit, the spark that lit a fire no storm could extinguish. The tide had turned in Maplewood, but tides always attract storms, and Frank Dalton soon found out that not everyone was cheering his neighborhood's awakening. It began with a letter slipped into his mailbox, crisp and cold, stamped with the town council's seal. "Cease and desist," it read, warning that unauthorized installations and gatherings were in violation of zoning ordinances. Frank read it twice, the words blurring in his tired eyes, then set it on the kitchen table where Michael found him staring at it with clenched fists. "They're scared," Michael said quietly, reading over his father's shoulder. "Scared of what we're building." Frank shook his head, his jaw tight. "Scared of losing control, you mean? They don't care if people freeze in winter or sweat in summer. They just want to keep the bills flowing." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I won't stop. Not now." But the pressure only mounted. The local utility company sent inspectors, men in hard hats who walked up and down Maplewood Lane with clipboards and scowls, jotting down notes like spies. Rumors spread that fines were coming, that connections would be severed, that the lights would go dark. Some neighbors grew anxious, whispers of fear replacing the laughter that had filled their gatherings. One evening, Mrs. Callahan knocked on Frank's door, wringing her hands. "Frank, I don't want to lose my house over this. They're saying they can raise our rates if we don't comply." Her voice trembled, and Frank's heart ached. He took her hand gently. "We'll fight this. You're not alone." He meant it, but inside he felt the weight pressing heavier, the old doubts creeping back. Was he dragging people into a battle they couldn't win? That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, the silence of the house broken only by the ticking clock. He thought of Elon Musk, of the interviews he had watched where Musk spoke about defying regulators, about pushing forward even when the odds seemed impossible. If something is important enough, Musk had said, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Frank whispered the words into the darkness, holding them like a shield. Days later, the battle spilled into public view. The town council called a special hearing, and Frank, urged by his neighbors, stood before the panel of suited officials in a stuffy room that smelled of old wood and dust. The mayor, a stern man with silver hair and a voice like gravel, tapped his gavel and said, "Mr. Dalton, we appreciate your passion, but your actions are unlawful. You are endangering lives with unregulated electrical setups. This ends now." Murmurs rippled through the audience, filled with Maplewood residents who had come to support Frank. He straightened his back, gripping the podium, his voice steady though his hands trembled. "With respect, sir, the only danger here is the stranglehold you've allowed the utility companies to have on ordinary people. We're not endangering lives, we're saving them. Saving families from freezing, saving seniors from choosing between medicine and electricity, saving kids from sitting in the dark when storms cut power. All we're doing is harnessing the sun. Last time I checked, the sun doesn't belong to any company." Applause erupted, the sound echoing off the walls. The mayor banged the gavel, shouting for order, but the fire had been lit. Still, the council voted to issue fines, threatening legal action if installations continued. It was a blow, and for a moment despair swept through the movement. Some neighbors hesitated to continue, worried about costs they couldn't bear. Frank felt the weight of their eyes on him, looking for guidance. That night, he gathered them in the church basement, the air thick with tension. "They want us scared," he said, his voice rising. "They want us small. But I've spent too many years living small, and I refuse to go back. Look around you, look at what we've built together. Is it perfect? No. But it's ours. And they can't take that from us unless we let them." The crowd roared with renewed resolve, the fear giving way to defiance. And so they pressed on. Volunteers worked quietly at night, installing panels under starlight, wires snaking through attics, batteries humming softly in basements. It felt like a rebellion, a quiet army of neighbors fighting not with weapons but with wrenches and determination. Frank led them, his body weary but his spirit unbreakable, each day fueled by the thought that he was no longer invisible, that his life carried weight again. Yet resistance hardened. Local newspapers published critical articles, branding him a reckless renegade. Talk radio hosts mocked him as a geriatric Musk wannabe, a man too old to know better. Even some family members turned skeptical. His daughter, Susan, called from Chicago, her voice sharp with worry. "Dad, you're going to get sued into the ground. Why can't you just enjoy your retirement? Why can't you let this go?" Frank's voice cracked but held firm. "Because I finally found something worth fighting for. Don't you see? This isn't about me, it's about all of us. And I can't quit, not now." When he hung up, tears burned his eyes, but the resolve only deepened. Weeks turned into months, and the battle became part of daily life. Letters from lawyers piled up on his kitchen table. Inspectors lurked at the end of the street. But the panels kept multiplying, roofs glittering with defiance, batteries humming like quiet heartbeats of resistance. One evening, as Frank tightened bolts on a new installation, Michael climbed onto the roof beside him. "Dad, you're in the history books already," he said with a grin. "Win or lose, you've started something no one can stop." Frank paused, sweat dripping down his brow, and looked out across Maplewood Lane, rooftops glinting in the fading sun. "Then let's make sure we don't lose," he whispered. And as the stars emerged, Frank Dalton, once forgotten and dismissed, stood taller than he ever had, ready to face whatever storm came next. The storm rolled in on a Friday night, the kind that bent trees sideways and turned streets into rivers. Frank Dalton watched from his porch as the wind howled and rain hammered the windows, the kind of storm that made you wonder if the world was trying to wash you clean or tear you apart. He thought of the panels, of the wires strung like veins through the neighborhood, and prayed silently they would hold. But when the lightning split the sky with a roar and the power grid snapped off with a sharp collective sigh, Frank's heart sank. Darkness swallowed Maplewood, except for the faint glow of battery-powered lights in some houses, proof their system worked. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. A sudden crack like gunfire split the night, followed by the unmistakable scent of burning insulation. Frank grabbed his flashlight and dashed into the storm, Michael close behind. They sprinted to Mrs. Callahan's house, where smoke curled from the side of the garage. Sparks danced in the rain, sizzling against the ground. "Shut it down!" Frank shouted, and with trembling hands he yanked the cutoff switch he had installed weeks earlier. The sparks died, but the damage was done, the battery casing had melted, charred black. Mrs. Callahan stood in the doorway, her face pale with terror. "Frank," she whispered, "what have we done?" The words cut him deeper than the storm ever could. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing, but not with excitement. Fear spread faster than the wind had the night before. People gathered in small circles, whispering about danger, lawsuits, fire. Frank moved among them, his shoulders heavy, his voice hoarse from explaining. It was one unit, one flaw. No one was hurt. That's why we installed cutoffs. It worked, we contained it. But fear doesn't bow easily to reason. Some neighbors who had once stood proudly at his side now looked at him with wary eyes. A man named Harris, who had volunteered from the start, pulled Frank aside. "I've got 2 kids, Frank. I can't risk this. I'm disconnecting my panels until we know it's safe." Frank nodded slowly, though the words felt like stones in his chest. He couldn't blame Harris. The responsibility weighed heavier than ever. That night, alone in his kitchen, Frank buried his face in his hands. The doubts returned, sharper than before. Maybe Susan was right. Maybe he should have stayed retired, let the world spin on without him. Who was he to lead anyone? He was just an old man with a dream too big for his hands. He thought of Elon Musk again, of the times he'd heard Musk speak about failure, rockets exploding, billions lost, ridicule from the world. "Failure is an option here," Musk had once said. "If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." Frank whispered the words like a prayer, but tonight they felt hollow. He had nearly burned down a neighbor's house. He wasn't a billionaire with engineers and resources, he was one man, and maybe he had gone too far. Michael found him slumped at the table, the half-empty coffee mug gone cold. "Dad, don't do this," Michael said softly. Frank didn't look up. "Do what?" "Don't give up." Frank let out a bitter laugh. "I nearly killed someone, Michael. How do I ask people to keep believing after that?" Michael pulled out his phone and set it on the table. On the screen was a video clip of Elon Musk after a SpaceX rocket failure. Reporters had mocked him, investors doubted him, but Musk had stood there and said, "We'll fix it. This is why we test. This is why we keep going." Michael pressed play, and the words filled the quiet kitchen. Frank lifted his head slowly, staring at the screen, and something stirred in his chest. He wasn't Musk, but he didn't have to be. He just had to keep going. The next day, he called a meeting in the church basement. The room was half empty compared to before, and the silence was heavy. Frank stood at the front, gripping the podium like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His voice shook as he began. "I failed you. I told you this was safe, and last night, I nearly proved myself a liar. If Mrs. Callahan had been standing in that garage, I don't know what would have happened. And for that, I take full responsibility. The room was still, faces tense. Frank took a deep breath. But here's the truth. Every breakthrough in history has come with risk. The first airplanes crashed. The first rockets exploded. The first light bulbs burned out more than they lit. But people kept going. They didn't quit, because they knew what was at stake. And I know what's at stake for us: freedom from being strangled by bills we can't pay, from power companies that don't care if we freeze or sweat, from a system that tells us we're powerless. Last night was a setback, not the end. If you want to walk away, I understand. But I'm not quitting. Not now, not ever. For a long moment, silence hung heavy, then Mrs. Callahan stood, her frail hands gripping her cane. "Frank," she said, her voice trembling, "you saved my house last night. If you hadn't installed that cutoff, I don't know what would have happened. You didn't fail, you learned. And if you're not quitting, neither am I." The room erupted in applause, and tears burned Frank's eyes. The setback had nearly broken him, but instead it became the crucible that hardened their resolve. Over the next weeks, they doubled down on safety. Electricians inspected every system, engineers from a nearby university volunteered to help design better batteries, and Frank worked day and night, his body aching but his spirit burning. The accident became less of a stain and more of a story, a warning they had survived, a lesson that made them stronger. And slowly, the fear gave way to confidence once more. But Frank never forgot the smell of smoke, the sight of Mrs. Callahan's terrified face. It haunted him, not as a mark of failure but as a reminder of the stakes. He carried it with him like a scar, proof that he was still alive, still fighting, still capable of leading even when the world tried to knock him down. One night, as he stood on his porch watching the panels gleam under the moonlight, Michael joined him. "You know," Michael said, "most people would have quit after that fire." Frank nodded slowly. "Most people aren't 72 with nothing left to lose." Michael laughed softly. "You've got plenty left to lose, Dad. And even more to give." Frank looked out at the street, at the quiet hum of the neighborhood powered in part by their own hands, and felt the truth of it. The setback had tested them, but they had endured. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this wasn't the last storm they would face. But he also knew one thing for certain: no storm, no setback, no fear could ever make him invisible again. The morning of the breakthrough began like any other, with Frank Dalton standing in his driveway staring at the panels lined across his roof, the sunlight bouncing off them in golden waves. For weeks, the neighborhood had worked tirelessly to fix what the storm had broken, patching wires, upgrading batteries, and doubling their safety checks. The setback had left scars, but scars are proof of healing, and Frank felt a quiet confidence that something was about to change. The air itself seemed different that morning, charged with anticipation. Michael had been pacing since dawn, coffee in hand, his nerves buzzing. "If this works," he said, "we're not just a bunch of stubborn folks with panels. We're proof. Real proof." Frank nodded slowly, his heart pounding beneath his ribs. Today, they were going to attempt something bigger than powering a few homes. They were going to run an entire block, lights, refrigerators, heaters, everything, completely off their solar battery system. If it succeeded, it would silence doubters, at least for a while. If it failed, well, Frank didn't want to think about that. By mid-morning, the street buzzed with activity. Neighbors emerged from their houses, carrying extension cords, tools, and nervous smiles. Kids chased each other across lawns, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the tension hanging in the air. Mrs. Callahan sat in a lawn chair, her cane resting beside her, determined to witness history. "I was here when Armstrong walked on the moon," she said with a wry grin. "If I lived long enough to see that, I'm living long enough to see this." Frank chuckled softly, the weight in his chest lightening for just a moment. At noon sharp, Michael climbed onto the makeshift stage they had built from plywood and cinder blocks. He raised his hands to quiet the crowd. "Folks, today isn't just about electricity. It's about proving what we already know, that when we come together, when we take control of our own destiny, we can do the impossible. My father will explain what's going to happen, but let me just say this, no matter what, we've already won. Because we stopped being afraid. Applause erupted, and Frank stepped up, his hands trembling as he gripped the microphone. He glanced at the faces before him, neighbors who had doubted, who had believed, who had suffered and hoped. His voice was steady, carrying the conviction of a man who had nothing left to prove but everything left to give. We're going to throw the switch, he said simply. If the system holds, this block will run on nothing but sunlight stored in our batteries. No grid, no company, just us and the sky. If it doesn't, he paused, letting the weight of it settle. Then we'll fix it until it does. A cheer rose, and Frank felt tears prick his eyes. He gave a nod to Michael, who climbed down and joined the crew near the master switchboard they had rigged in Frank's garage. The countdown began, 10, 9, 8. The crowd shouted in unison, voices echoing down the street, hope and fear entwined. 3, 2, 1. Michael pulled the lever. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, like a wave sweeping across the block, lights flickered on in every house. Porch lamps glowed, kitchen windows lit up, televisions buzzed to life. Refrigerators hummed, fans spun, and a collective gasp filled the air. They had done it. The street was alive, running on sunlight and grit and the sheer will of a community that refused to quit. The cheer that followed shook the air, louder than the storm that had once nearly destroyed them. Neighbors hugged, kids jumped up and down, Mrs. Callahan wept openly into her handkerchief. Frank stood frozen, the sight burning into his memory, the proof that dreams weren't just dreams if you dared to chase them. Michael grabbed his father's shoulders, his eyes blazing with triumph. Dad, we did it. Do you see this? We actually did it. Frank laughed, a sound that was half sob, half joy. No, son, he whispered, looking out at the sea of faces. We did it. Reporters showed up within hours, tipped off by someone in the crowd who had filmed the moment and posted it online. The video spread like wildfire, a shaky clip of an old man wiping tears from his cheeks as a street erupted in cheers. Headlines ran with phrases like, "The Maplewood Miracle," and "Neighborhood Goes Solar Without Permission." Some praised them as pioneers, others mocked them as rebels, but one thing was undeniable, the world was watching. Frank sat for his first interview on his porch, the reporter's camera trained on him as he spoke with quiet passion. I'm not an engineer, he said. I'm not a billionaire. I'm just a man who got tired of being told it was too late. Too late for me, too late for my neighbors, too late to make a difference. Well, it's not too late. Not for any of us. The clip aired on the evening news, and soon Frank's phone buzzed with calls from strangers across the country, people asking how they could do the same in their towns, people thanking him for giving them hope, people who admitted they had thought life was over for them until they saw Maplewood light up. Frank listened, humbled and overwhelmed. He had never set out to inspire anyone beyond his street, but now his fight had become a symbol. Still, with the attention came new pressure. The utility company issued stronger threats, lawyers drafted lawsuits, and the council doubled down on its resistance. But Frank found he wasn't afraid anymore. The breakthrough had given him more than electricity, it had given him undeniable proof that they were right, that ordinary people could claim power, literally and figuratively. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the panels drank in its last rays, Frank sat with Michael on the porch. The neighborhood was lit, steady and strong, not a flicker in sight. The hum of independence filled the air. You know, Frank said, his voice quiet, I used to think I was done. Invisible. Just an old man waiting for time to take me. But this, he gestured to the glowing houses, the sound of laughter drifting from open windows. This is my second chance. Our second chance. Michael nodded, his hand resting on his father's shoulder. You gave it to us, Dad. You gave it to everyone. Frank shook his head slowly. No. We gave it to each other. I just lit the first spark. The breakthrough was more than electricity, it was proof that age was not an ending, that community was stronger than corporations, that hope was stronger than fear. And as Frank closed his eyes that night, the hum of the batteries whispering like lullabies, he knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was still ahead. But for the first time in decades, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. The news trucks arrived first, their satellite dishes rising above the houses like strange metal trees, their cameras rolling as children waved and neighbors tried not to stare. Maplewood Lane had never seen so many strangers at once, journalists in pressed suits, photographers snapping shots of rooftops, producers barking into headsets. The Maplewood Miracle had gone viral, and now the world wanted a closer look. Frank Dalton, who had once been just another old man on a quiet street, suddenly found himself at the center of a storm bigger than any weather. It began with local outlets, then regional papers, and within a week, national media descended. One morning, Frank opened his door to find a young reporter from New York standing on his porch, microphone in hand, asking, "Mr. Dalton, how does it feel to be leading a grassroots revolution?" He nearly laughed, the question so surreal. "Ma'am," he said, scratching his head, "I don't know about revolutions. I'm just trying to keep the lights on." But his humility only fueled the story, and soon clips of his wrinkled face, his trembling hands, and his steady voice spread across television screens from coast to coast. Maplewood became a symbol, and Frank became its reluctant figurehead. At first, he resisted the attention. He was no politician, no businessman, no preacher. But as he watched the footage, his neighbors standing proudly beside him, their homes glowing under panels they had built with their own hands, he realized this was bigger than discomfort. This was a chance to amplify their fight. He agreed to interviews, speaking not with polished sound bites but with the raw honesty of a man who had lived too many years feeling invisible. "We're not radicals," he told one anchor. "We're not anarchists. We're just ordinary Americans who got tired of being told what we can't do. They say we're too old, too poor, too powerless to matter. Well, we're proving them wrong." The words resonated far beyond Maplewood. Letters poured in from seniors across the country, handwritten notes trembling with emotion. "I'm 78, one woman wrote, and I thought my life was just waiting to end. Then I saw you on TV, and for the first time in years, I feel like I can start something new." Another man, a Vietnam veteran, sent a photo of himself installing a small solar kit in his backyard, captioned simply, "Thanks for the push." Frank wept as he read them, each message a reminder that their struggle was sparking fires in hearts he would never meet. But with the spotlight came shadows. The utility company launched an aggressive campaign, flooding airwaves with ads warning of dangerous, unregulated experiments in Maplewood. Lobbyists whispered in lawmakers' ears, framing Frank as a reckless agitator. Lawsuits were filed, demanding immediate shutdowns and heavy fines. One evening, as Frank returned home from an interview, he found protesters on his lawn, men and women holding signs that read, "Stop the danger," and "Don't burn our town." Their voices rose in angry chants, drowning out his neighbors who had gathered in support. Michael pulled him inside, locking the door as fists banged against it. "Dad, this is getting dangerous," Michael said, his face pale. Frank sank into his chair, the weight of it pressing down. For a moment, the old doubts whispered again, maybe he was too old, maybe he had gone too far. But then he remembered the letters, the faces of his neighbors, the light in their homes. He looked at Michael with steady eyes. "If they think they can scare me off, they don't know how stubborn an old man can be." The next day, Frank stood before cameras again, this time addressing not just his town but the entire country. His voice was tired but unshaken. "We're not reckless. We're careful. We're not dangerous. We're determined. And we won't be silenced, because this fight isn't just about Maplewood, it's about every American who's ever been told to sit down and be quiet, to stop dreaming because of their age, their wallet, or their place in life. Well, I'm here to tell you, it's never too late. The clip exploded online, shared millions of times. Talk shows debated him, politicians name-dropped him, and activists rallied around him. Elon Musk himself, in a rare tweet, wrote, "Frank Dalton and Maplewood remind us that innovation belongs to everyone. Age is just a number. Sunlight is for all." Frank nearly dropped his coffee when Michael read it aloud. "Elon Musk knows your name, Dad," Michael said, grinning like a boy again. Frank shook his head in disbelief, but inside, a warmth spread. He had borrowed courage from Musk's words for so long, now Musk was amplifying his. The national spotlight also brought allies. Environmental groups offered resources. Engineers volunteered expertise. A university invited Frank to speak at a symposium on grassroots energy. At first, he declined, nervous about standing before scholars, but Michael urged him on. "Dad, they need to hear the truth from someone real. Not charts, not theories, your story." So Frank went, standing before a room of academics in his worn suit, his voice cracking as he spoke of loneliness, of invisibility, of finding purpose again through sunlight and sweat. By the time he finished, the room rose in a standing ovation, and Frank realized he was no longer just a neighborhood figure. He was becoming a symbol for a nation starved for proof that change was possible. Yet the pressure mounted. Lawsuits dragged on, bills piled up, and threats grew sharper. Some nights, Frank sat awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of so many eyes on him. He feared letting them down, feared the fire would consume them before it truly caught. But then he would hear the quiet hum of the batteries, see the soft glow of his neighbors' homes, and the fear would fade, replaced by resolve. One evening, after another long day of interviews and strategy meetings, Frank sat on his porch watching the sunset. Michael joined him, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. The sky blazed with color, the panels shimmering like jewels. "You realize what's happening, right?" Michael said. Frank sipped his coffee, his hands steady. "Feels like I'm standing in the middle of a hurricane." Michael smiled faintly. "No, Dad. Feels like you've become the eye of the storm." Frank looked out at the street, the cameras, the lights, the people. For years, he had been invisible. Now the entire nation was watching. And as the stars blinked into view, he whispered to himself, "So be it. Let them watch." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?